The morning the blizzard broke, Horace Van walked down from the ridge road with frost still white on his beard and his coat frozen stiff as saddle leather, and he stood at the sealed entrance to what he had spent the better part of a year calling the Widow's Folly. He stood there long enough that his boots left two dark circles in the snow where the warmth coming through the mortared stone had, just barely, begun to melt it. Then the timber door swung open, and the air that rolled out was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and it smelled of lamp oil and hay, and the particular close warmth of people who have been alive together for 8 days in a place the cold could not reach. He took his hat off. That was all he said with his body. But after a moment, looking past Brett at the 9 people arranged on pallets and folded wool behind her, he said quietly that he supposed she had known what she was doing. She had. She had known since the summer of 1888, and she had known because a man she buried in the autumn of 1887 had spent 3 years teaching her to read limestone the way a farmer reads sky. If you are watching this for the first time, consider leaving a comment below. These stories take a great deal of time to build right, and hearing from you makes every one of them worth it. Now, let me tell you about Brett Caldwell. She was 22 years old when Elias died. 22, and the mother of Ruth, who was 4, and Silas, who was 2, and the tenant of a leased hollow in the hill country of western Virginia, in a county where the creek ran limestone white after rain, and the ridges were old enough that the rock at their cores had been laid down before anything walked on 4 legs. She had $19 in a tin box, and 2 children who did not yet fully understand that their father was not coming back from the quarry at Greer's Bluff. The quarry accident happened on the 15th of October, 1887. A stone ledge that Elias had marked as suspect gave way while he was measuring its face, and the fall was 40 feet onto rubble, and it was over before anyone reached him. He was 31 years old. He had worked as a surveyor mason for 11 years, longer than Brett had known him, and in those 11 years, he had mapped more than 40 limestone cave systems across 3 counties, charting their mouths and their cold air signatures and the way the rock conducted or shed heat depending on its depth and its moisture, and the thickness of the overburden above. He carried his notes in a tin box with a hinged lid and a clasp of bent copper, and when they brought his body home, the tin box was in his coat pocket. Brett did not open it for 3 weeks. She fed the children and paid the November portion of the lease from her $19 and sat by the lamp in the evenings after they were asleep, and the tin box sat on the mantel shelf and did not ask anything of her. When she finally opened it, the notes inside were written in Elias's close, precise hand on folded paper, each sheet labeled with a location and a date and a set of measurements: temperature at the mouth, temperature at the first bend, temperature at depth, direction of draft, estimated thermal gradient, and on one sheet near the bottom of the stack, a note that was not measurements at all, just a sentence in the same careful hand. Air that does not freeze the flame at the mouth will not freeze it at depth, and what holds 50 degrees in August will hold 50 degrees in January. She had heard him say that. She had been 20 years old, standing at the mouth of a cave 3 miles from where they were living, holding a candle, while Elias read the draft against the back of his wrist. He had turned to her and said it the way he said most things he considered settled, without flourish, as a simple report of how the world worked. Air that does not freeze the flame at the mouth will not freeze it at depth. She had listened. That was the whole inheritance. Not money, not land, not a clear deed to the hollow they lived in. A sentence about air, and a tin box full of measurements, and 2 children who needed to be warm. The cave behind the falls was less than a quarter mile from the cabin, up the creek bed, and behind the curtain of water that came off the limestone shelf in spring and slowed to a thin veil by October. Brett had known it was there since her first summer in the hollow. She had never gone more than a few yards inside, in February of 1888, with the ground still frozen and the children bundled into the cabin with Cora Fitch sitting watch, while Brett walked the creek in the cold gray light. She went inside and held a candle at the entrance and watched the flame. It bent inward, just slightly, just enough to catch, the draft pulling from outside toward the interior, which meant the cave was deeper than it looked, and the air inside was warmer than the air at the entrance. She stayed for 20 minutes, going deeper with each step, and the temperature rose as the draft steadied, and when she had gone perhaps 60 feet in, past a narrow shoulder of rock where the passage opened into a vaulted room the size of a modest barn, she held the candle still and the flame stood perfectly upright. She took out Elias's tin and checked the notation one more time. Then she walked back to the cabin in the February cold and told Cora she was going to seal the cave before first frost. Cora was a widow herself, 61 years old, practical about most things the way a person becomes practical when they have outlived a husband and 2 harvests in a row. She looked at Brett across the kitchen table and said she thought that was a sensible idea, which was more than most people in the valley would say. What followed from that February decision through the early months of 1888 was a period of waiting and planning and small material accumulation. Brett could not begin the real work until the ground thawed and the falls had thinned enough to work beside without soaking everything she carried. She used the waiting months to take stock of what the cave needed and what she had and what the gap between those 2 things was going to cost her. She needed mortar and fitted stone to close the entrance down to a single timber door frame, leaving a door narrow enough to be sealed from inside with a wooden bar and wide enough to bring a mule through in an emergency. She needed that door, thick timber, pegged rather than nailed, because nails in wet limestone conditions rust faster than the wood rots. She needed a ventilation port near the ceiling of the outer passage, small enough to be plugged from inside, large enough to keep the air from going stale in a week. She needed stored fuel, stored food, stored water, and bedding for how many people she was not yet certain, though she was beginning to suspect the number would be larger than her own household. She had a mule named Patience, who had come to her as part of Elias's equipment, and who was, for a mule, unusually tolerant of dark enclosed spaces and the smell of limestone water. Patience hauled stone from the creek bed in a sledge Brett rigged from 2 fence rails and a plank, and hauled timber from a stand of locust up the ridge, and stood in the fall spray without complaint, while Brett mortared courses of stone into the cave mouth 1 row at a time. The work began in earnest in late April of 1888, once the melt had slowed, and it continued through the spring and into summer, and on into the early fall. It was visible work. The hollow was not remote enough to hide it. A person walking the creek road could see by June that the widow up the way was doing something to the rock face behind the falls, something that involved a mule and a great deal of mortar and a timber door that leaned against the cliff waiting to be hung. The valley talked about most things visible, and it talked about this. The first time Horace Van used the phrase was in June, on the porch of his general store, which faced the road and served as the county's primary clearinghouse for opinion. Horace was 54 years old and had been running the store for 20 years and had strong views about most things, which he held with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything he couldn't afford to be wrong about. He was not a cruel man in any theatrical sense. He was simply a man who had decided early what the world's order was and who grew impatient with evidence to the contrary. A farmer named Aldous came into the store with a 1/4 pound of nails and the news that the Caldwell widow had now got a door hung in the cliff face, and Horace said, without looking up from the counter, that he supposed she was building herself a monument to nothing, same as everything else she'd been doing since the spring. Then he said it was the widow's folly, plain and simple, and Aldous laughed, and the name settled into the valley's vocabulary the way such names do, with a kind of easy permanence. Cora Fitch was in the store that day, buying salt. She said, from the far end of the counter, that she didn't see what was foolish about a person preparing a shelter. Horace told her, not unkindly, that there was a difference between preparing a shelter and walling yourself into a hole in the mountain. Cora said she wasn't sure the distinction mattered much in a January storm. Horace said January storms were what cabins were for, and that was the end of the conversation. Or rather, that was the point at which the store's other patrons stopped listening and went back to their business, which is a different thing, but accomplishes the same result. Brett heard about it from Cora. She was fitting the ventilation port that week, a careful job, because the angle of the port mattered and the depth of the plug mattered, and getting either one wrong meant the cave would either fill with dead air or bleed heat into the outside cold. She listened to Cora's account of the store conversation while she measured the port's diameter against a wooden plug she turned on a borrowed lathe, and when Cora was done, she said she thought the port diameter was right and went back to measuring, which wasn't indifference so much as economy, the kind a person develops when they have a great deal left to do and a finite amount of time to do it in. The Valley's opinion sharpened through the summer as the work became more extensive and therefore more visible. By August, the entrance was sealed to a clean, mortared face with a fitted door and a latch bar, and inside, Brett had stacked 2 winters' worth of cut wood against the cave's east wall and begun moving in dried goods in sealed crocks. Patience had her own section of the vaulted room, separated by a timber rail, with 2 months of fodder in canvas bags stacked against the rail. Brett had hung 6 lanterns from iron pegs driven into the limestone and lined the sleeping area with 3 layers of pine needle batting covered by old canvas, which held warmth the way a bird's feathers hold warmth, by trapping air close against the body. In late August, she brought Ruth and Silas into the cave for an afternoon to accustom them to its smell and its dark and its quiet. And Ruth, who was 5 by then, walked the length of the vaulted room with her arms out as if she were measuring it, and said it was very big. Silas sat on the pine batting and ate dried apple from his fist, and did not seem troubled by anything. In October, Horace said it again. He was speaking to the circuit rider, a minister named Gould, who had stopped at the store on his route, and the subject of winter preparations had come up, as it always did in October in hill country. Horace mentioned the widow's folly as a cautionary example of what grief does to a person's practical judgment. Gould said he'd heard about it and asked what exactly the woman had done. Horace said she'd sealed herself a cave and filled it with wood and put a door on it like a house, and moved half her goods inside all summer long, instead of reinforcing the cabin, which is what a rational person would have done. Gould asked if perhaps she had both the cave and the cabin to rely on. Horace said the point wasn't whether it would work. The point was that it was not the kind of thing a person in a sound mind does. Gould wrote this exchange in his journal. He was not certain at the time which of them was right. The 3rd time Horace said it was in November, 1888, which was the most public occasion of the 3, because by that time the finished work was widely known, and the curiosity had shifted from puzzlement to settled contempt. A group of men gathered on the store porch on a cold Saturday, and Horace said that the widow up the hollow had spent 7 months sealing the widow's folly, and whatever the next winter brought, he expected she'd spend it sitting in a cave in the dark like a groundhog, and that some people's grief ran in strange directions. Nobody objected this time. Cora wasn't there. Brett was aware of what the valley said. She had lived in a valley most of her life and understood that what a valley says and what a valley needs are two different things, and that the distance between those two things is where a person either shrinks or holds. She had spent enough time in the cave by November to know, in the way a person knows a room they have built with their own hands, every variation in its temperature across a day, every slight shift in the draft when the wind changed outside, every note of the falls filtered through the mortared stone into a low, steady sound like breathing. She knew the cave at 51 degrees, and she knew it at 54, and she knew what Elias's note had promised her, and she held those things close and let the valley say what it needed to say. The 1st of January, 1889, came in cold but not yet unusual. A sharp frost, ground like iron, the sky a hard white that did not much resemble clouds. Brett had moved the last of the winter stores into the cave the week before Christmas and had told Cora plainly that her door was open if the weather turned serious. Cora had not said no. The storm arrived on the 8th of January. It came from the northwest, which was where the hardest weather always came from in that country. But it came faster than the signs had suggested, and with a violence that the older residents would later say was unlike anything in their recollection, which in some cases went back 40 years. By the morning of the 9th, the snow was 3 feet deep in the hollow and still falling, and the temperature had dropped to levels that the thermometer Brett kept nailed to the cabin doorpost registered as negative 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and still falling. She waited until midday on the 9th, watching the drifts build against the cabin walls, listening to the wind, and watching the thermometer. When it reached negative 15, she dressed the children in every layer they owned and went for Cora. Cora's cabin was 200 yards up the creek road. The distance took 20 minutes in the drifts. Brett found her neighbor at the kitchen table with a quilt over her shoulders and a fire that was losing the argument with the cold coming through the walls, and the temperature inside was barely 38 degrees. Cora stood up without being asked and took the quilt and her coat and her tin of tea and followed Brett out into the white. The Marsh family lived at the far end of the hollow. Tom Marsh was 38. His wife, Delia, was 34. And they had 3 children between the ages of 6 and 12. On the evening of the 9th, Tom came to Brett's cabin in the snow, which took him an hour and cost him badly, and said the family's firewood was nearly gone, and their oldest had a fever, and they had nowhere to go. Brett told him about the cave. Tom went back for his wife and children and returned 4 hours later, and Brett counted 7 people now in the sealed cave, plus herself and her 2, 9 in total, arranged on the pine batting with the lanterns burning and the ventilation port closed against the cold, and the temperature holding at 52 degrees. The storm ran for 8 days. Inside the cave, time passed the way it does in a place where there is no window and no horizon, in meals and sleeps and the slow burning down of lamp oil measured against the reserve supply. Ruth read aloud from a primer by lamplight while Silas slept curled against Patience's side, and the mule stood in her stall with a steady patience that did not seem like a performance. Cora organized the food rationing without being asked, and divided the dried goods by day with a precision that left a small margin on each side, enough that no one went hungry. Tom Marsh's oldest child's fever broke on the 4th day. The temperature in the cave did not once, across 8 days, fall below 50 degrees. Outside, the temperature on the 3rd day reached negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Brett knew this because she checked the thermometer through a narrow gap in the mortared frame when the wind was briefly still, reaching through and reading it by lamplight, and then sealing the gap again with a plug of rags. Negative 22. She read the number twice and sealed the gap, and went back to where the children were, and sat down and said nothing about it. On the fourth day, Tom Marsh said he was going to try to reach the town, 5 miles up the Ridge Road, to fetch the doctor for his eldest, who was then still feverish. Brett told him the Ridge Road would be buried under 6 feet of drift at minimum, and the temperature had not risen above -18 in 2 days, and that a man on foot in those conditions had, she estimated, less than 2 hours before he was in danger. Tom said he had a responsibility to his family. Brett said staying alive was the most important part of that responsibility. They looked at each other across the lamplight for a long moment, and Tom Marsh said he would wait one more day. He waited. The fever broke that same night. They learned later what had happened beyond the sealed door during those 8 days. 2 families on the far side of the ridge had tried to consolidate into one cabin, and succeeded, but barely. One man had frostbitten toes he would lose in part. A family in the next hollow lost their livestock, the cold coming through the barn walls between the second and third night. And on the fourth day, James Dolan, who was Delia Marsh's nearest neighbor, and a man of 63 who had lived in the valley longer than almost anyone, had walked out of his cabin to reach his brother's house 1.5 miles across open ground, and had not arrived. They found him on the 9th day, after the storm broke, 200 yards from his own door. 9 people survived inside the cave. One man died within walking distance of shelter he did not know existed. On the morning of the 8th day, January the 16th, the wind stopped. It stopped with the finality of a door closing. The silence after it so complete that Silas woke from sleep and asked if something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. The storm was simply done. Brett unbarred the timber door and pushed it open against the snow drifted against the outside face, and stepped out into a world that was still and white, and so cold the air hurt to breathe. The falls behind her were frozen to a curtain of yellow ice. The snow in the hollow was chest deep. The sky was a blue so pale it was almost white, and the sun was out, low and winter small, burning with a light that had no warmth yet, but was at least honest about being there. She was standing in that light when she heard him on the Ridge Road. Horace Van, working his way down toward the hollow with a horse and a borrowed scoop blade, clearing enough of a path to travel. He had been at his sister's place 2 miles up the ridge when the storm came and had ridden it out there, and he was heading back to his store to assess the damage, and the path down through the hollow was the most direct route. He saw the open door. He saw the cleared space around it where the mortared stone met the cliff face, and the smoke trail from the ventilation port above, and Brett standing in the snow with her coat buttoned and her color good and her eyes clear. He slid off the horse and walked up to the entrance, and the warm air coming through the opening moved past his frozen beard and against his face, and he stopped. He looked past her at the 8 people visible inside, arranged on pallets and wool, alive and fed and unremarkably warm. He took his hat off. He held it in both hands. Then he said quietly that he supposed she had known what she was doing. Brett said she had had good instructions. She said it without bitterness and without triumph, which is the only way a person can say a thing like that and have it mean what it should mean. She meant Elias. She meant the tin box and the candle flame and the note in the careful hand and the 3 years of standing beside a man who read the earth's cold the way other men read weather or water. Horace put his hat back on. He asked if they needed anything from the store. Brett said they needed coffee and lamp oil and, if he had it, another 25 pounds of cornmeal. He noted it down in his coat pocketbook. Then he stood there a moment longer looking at the mortared stone and the fitted timber and the ventilation port above, and he said not to anyone in particular that it was a good piece of work. He rode to the store and back that same afternoon with the coffee and the lamp oil and the cornmeal. and he did not charge Brett for any of it. That was his apology, made in the currency available to him. Gould, the circuit rider, came through in March, after the snowmelt had made the ridge road passable again. He asked Brett if he could see the cave, and she showed him the entrance and the vaulted room and the ventilation port and the timber stall where patients had stood for 8 days and the pine batting floor and the stored goods still partially in place. He asked her to explain the principle of the cold air reading, and she sat with him on the flat stone outside the entrance and explained it slowly, the way Elias had explained it to her, using the candle flame as the demonstration, holding the candle at the entrance and letting him watch the bend of the flame. He took notes in a separate journal from the one he used for sermons, a smaller one he kept for what he called matters of practical record. He asked her the source of the knowledge, and she said her husband had been a surveyor mason who had spent 11 years charting limestone cave systems, and that he had kept his notes in a tin box, and she still had it. Gould asked if he might copy the relevant entries. Brett got the tin from the cabin and they sat together for 2 hours, while Gould copied Elias's temperature tables and the draft reading method into his practical journal. And when they were done, he said he intended to pass the information on to every household he could reach on his circuit. Brett said she hoped it would be useful. She brought him a cup of coffee and went back to the work of the day, which was splitting wood for the cabin with Ruth and Silas, watching from the doorstep in the mild March sun. By that afternoon, she had almost forgotten he was there, absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of the hollow, the wood stack growing, the children arguing quietly about something in the grass, Patience standing in her paddock with her head over the rail, watching the proceedings with her characteristic expression of mild professional skepticism. Gould carried the method south that spring and east that autumn, and in the 2 years that followed, 4 families in the surrounding counties sealed natural cave entrances, following the same principles Brett had applied, checking draft and temperature before committing to the work, fitting timber doors and ventilation ports according to the dimensions Gould had noted down. A school teacher in the next county, a woman named Alice Pruitt, who made it her business to understand the practical knowledge of the communities she served, encountered Gould's notes in the 4th year and began teaching the cave reading method in her classroom, not as an emergency measure, but as a part of what she called household knowledge, the kind of knowing that lives in the hands and the nose and the skin before it lives in books. She attributed the method by name. She called it the Caldwell Shelter Principle, after the hollow and the woman, and wrote the attribution into the written version she prepared for the county school board in 1893. Horace Van heard about the attribution the following year, when a copy of the school board's pamphlet came into his store in a bundle of printed materials from the county seat. He read the pamphlet twice. He mentioned it to a customer and said that the widow up the hollow had turned out to know a thing or two about limestone, which was, from Horace, approximately the same as a formal apology, and which everyone who knew him understood as such. The name The Widow's Folly did not disappear immediately from the valley's vocabulary. Names like that rarely do. They fade the way chalk writing on a board fades when the board is used for something else, slowly replaced by the new marks rather than erased directly. By 1895, most people in the valley who referred to the cave at all called it the Caldwell Shelter, or sometimes just the shelter behind the falls, and the original label had become a kind of minor local history, the kind a person mentions only to show they have been in the valley long enough to remember when it was current. Brett was 30 years old in 1895, which is not old, though the years between 22 and 30 had moved through her the way a river moves through limestone country, wearing the surface smooth and carving the interior into shapes that are only visible from the inside. Ruth was 12 by then, old enough to help with the annual inspection of the cave, checking the mortar and the ventilation port and the condition of the stores. Silas was 10, old enough to carry, and he and Patience maintained an understanding that seemed to be based on Silas bringing her apples and Patience tolerating the rest of his attentions in exchange. Brett continued to check the cave every year, in late October before the first hard frost, carrying a candle and a thermometer and Elias's tin box, which she still had, the copper clasp green now but still functional. She would go in with the candle and check the draft at the entrance and the temperature at the interior room, and write the readings in a small notebook she had started keeping for the purpose, and compare them against Elias's original notes. The numbers were consistent. Year after year, the cave held 51 to 54 degrees at the depth of the vaulted room, regardless of what the air outside was doing. The rock kept its temperature the way rock has always kept its temperature, with the indifference of mass, with the patience of something that has been doing it for longer than any disagreement about whether it was foolish. Cora Fitch lived to be 78. She spent her last winters in the cabin Brett had kept up and improved, the two women sharing the hollow through the cold months with an arrangement that did not require much discussion, because both of them were people who understood that what needed doing made itself evident without announcement. Cora died in the late winter of 1896, on a cold night in February in the cabin, with Brett beside her, which was how she had said she wanted it. Delia Marsh, whose husband had waited those 4 days and whose eldest child had recovered from the fever, named her next child Brett, a girl born in the spring of 1890. Brett Caldwell heard about the naming from Cora, who told her on a May morning in the cabin with the window open and the creek running high and green outside, and she sat with it for a moment and then went back to whatever she'd been doing before, because that was the nature of the hollow and the nature of the woman who lived in it. She taught the cave reading method herself, directly, to every person who asked, and some who had not thought to ask. She showed them the candle trick at the entrance of the sealed cave, the bend of the flame, the way the draft betrayed the interior's warmth before you had gone far enough to feel it yourself. She showed them the temperature differential between the entrance and the vaulted room, and explained the limestone's thermal mass in the plain language Elias had always used, the language of how rather than why, because how was what kept people alive when the weather turned serious. She gave copies of Elias's temperature tables to anyone who wanted them, and let Alice Pruitt's schoolroom pamphlet carry the formalized version to people she would never meet. She kept the tin box on the mantel shelf where it had always been. The copper clasp had gone entirely green by the turn of the century. The papers inside were still legible, Elias's careful hand not much faded, the measurements still precise, the note at the bottom of the stack still reading exactly what it had always read. She did not need to take it down to remember what it said. She knew it by then the way she knew the cave, from the inside. The cave stood through the great cold of 1899, and through the flood year of 1902, and through each successive winter that came down from the northwest with the particular intention of that country's weather, and it held its temperature through all of them, because the rock did not care what year it was, and the thermal mass did not care what the valley thought of the woman who had understood it. 4 families, sheltered there across 3 separate winters before the hollow's population, changed enough that the cave became more historical than operational, a thing people knew about, and tended and pointed out to visitors as an example of what practical knowledge looked like when it was applied without permission. The falls still came off the limestone shelf each spring in a white curtain, thinner by August, near silence by October, and the sealed entrance behind them was as solid as the day Brett had finished it. The mortar courses tight, the timber door weathered gray, the ventilation port still in its correct angle above. You could put your hand against the mortared stone on a January morning and feel faintly through the rock the particular warmth of 52 degrees, pressing outward against the cold, the way a held breath presses against a closed mouth. Patience. The mule died in the autumn of 1901, at an age that the local horse doctor estimated at approximately 23 years, which is old for a mule and which seemed to anyone who had watched her haul stone and timber up a creek bed through a spring and summer with complete professional equanimity, entirely appropriate. Brett buried her in the upper paddock and marked the place with a flat limestone slab, no inscription, because the stone needed no inscription to be what it was. What Elias had left behind was not money and not land. It was the sentence about air and the method behind it, and the habit of reading what was present rather than assuming what should be. It was the understanding that the Earth's temperature is not an accident but a fact, steady and available and asking only to be noticed. He had spent 11 years noticing it, and he had given that noticing to a woman of 20 years standing at a cave mouth with a candle, and she had carried it forward into a valley that did not, at first, know what to do with her. And the valley had been warm for it. On a clear day in January, years after the blizzard of 1889 had passed into the county's weather history, a person standing at the falls could see the ventilation port above the sealed door, and if the air outside was cold enough, they could see rising from the port the faint plume of warmer air meeting the January cold and becoming visible for just a moment before it dispersed. It looked in that light very much like a breath,